The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Sullivan family estate in Westchester County, New York. Emma stood in the spacious living room, her hands trembling slightly as she held a leather folder containing the lease agreement for her new art gallery space in Manhattan's Lower East Side. At 30 years old, she had finally gathered the courage to pursue the dream she'd buried for a decade. The gallery would showcase emerging artists, the kind of raw, authentic work that spoke to real human experiences. Everything her parents' carefully curated world wasn't. Her parents sat across from her on the cream-colored leather sofa that had cost more than most people's cars. James Sullivan, a prominent restaurant magnate whose name appeared regularly in the business section of the New York Times, sat with his arms crossed over his custom-tailored shirt. His salt-and-pepper hair was perfectly styled, his Rolex catching the fading sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Catherine, her mother, wore her signature three-strand pearl necklace and an expression of barely concealed disappointment that Emma had seen countless times throughout her life. The December wind rattled the tall windows of the estate, causing the crystal chandelier above them to tinkle softly. Emma could see the perfectly manicured grounds outside, the hedges trimmed into geometric precision, dusted with the first snow of the season. The circular driveway where luxury cars often parked during her parents' frequent dinner parties stretched toward the ornate iron gates that separated the Sullivan property from the rest of the world. An art gallery? James's voice dripped with contempt, each word carefully measured for maximum impact. Emma, we didn't pay $70,000 a year for your business degree at Cornell so you could waste it on some bohemian fantasy in a neighborhood that probably isn't even safe after dark. Emma straightened her shoulders, feeling the familiar weight of their judgment pressing down on her like a physical force. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. It's not a fantasy, Dad. I've secured funding through a small business loan, found the perfect location near several established galleries, and I've already connected with 12 incredibly talented artists who are excited to exhibit their work. I have a complete business plan, projected revenues, marketing strategies. Enough. Catherine cut her off with a sharp wave of her manicured hand, her diamond rings catching the light. This is absolutely embarrassing, Emma. What will people think? What will we tell the Hendersons? The Whitfields? The Sullivans don't run art galleries in questionable neighborhoods. We build empires. Real businesses that matter. Restaurants that employ hundreds of people. Properties that appreciate in value. Emma had heard these arguments before, this emphasis on reputation and status that had governed every decision in her life. The right prep school. The right university. The right sorority. The right internships. The right social circles. Everything calculated to maintain and enhance the Sullivan family image. I'm not asking for your approval, Emma said quietly, though her voice carried more strength than she felt inside. I'm informing you of my decision. Out of respect, as a courtesy. But this is happening whether you support it or not. James stood abruptly, his 6-foot frame towering over her in a posture of dominance he'd perfected over decades in boardrooms and negotiations. His face flushed red, a warning sign Emma recognized from childhood, the signal that his temper was rising. You're making a catastrophic mistake, Emma. Without our connections, without our name properly backing you up, without access to the right investors and clientele, you'll fail within 6 months. Mark my words. You'll be nothing, Emma. Absolutely nothing. The word hung in the air like poison, settling over the room with an almost tangible weight. Nothing. Emma had heard variations of this threat her entire life, delivered in different contexts but always carrying the same message. Nothing without the right husband from the right family with the right connections. Nothing without a proper position in the family business or an adjacent industry they approved of. Nothing without their guidance, their money, their carefully cultivated influence. Every choice had been mapped out for her since birth, the trajectory of her life planned like a corporate merger. She remembered being 8 years old, showing her mother a painting she'd done in art class, proud of the colors and the way she'd captured the light on the lake near their summer house. Catherine had barely glanced at it before saying, "That's nice, dear, but you should focus more on your mathematics. Art is a hobby, not a future." She remembered being 16, telling her father she wanted to study fine arts in college. James had laughed, actually laughed, and said, "Artists starve, Emma. Sullivans don't starve. You'll study business or economics." End of discussion. She remembered being 25, finally receiving access to her grandmother Helen's inheritance, and her parents insisting she invest it in their restaurant expansion rather than waste it on frivolous things. But standing there in that cold, perfect living room with its museum-quality artwork that no one ever really looked at and its furniture that was meant to impress rather than comfort, something fundamental shifted inside Emma. She looked at her parents, really looked at them, and saw not the powerful figures she'd feared her entire life, but two people so terrified of losing control that they'd rather destroy their daughter's dreams than let her live independently. "Then I'll be nothing on my own terms," Emma replied, her voice clear and firm, surprising herself with her own conviction. "I'd rather be nothing authentic than something false." Catherine's eyes narrowed dangerously, her perfectly applied makeup unable to hide the anger tightening her features. "Don't be dramatic, Emma. You're confused. Emotional. You're not thinking rationally about the consequences of this decision. Take some time, a few weeks, perhaps, to really consider what you're throwing away." "I've been thinking about it for 10 years, Mom." Emma's voice rose slightly, years of suppressed frustration finally finding voice. "Since I was 20 and you convinced me to switch my major from fine arts to business administration. Since I was 25 and you pressured me to date Marcus Whitfield because his family owned half of Connecticut and it would be a strategic alliance. Since I was 27 and you made me turn down a job at a gallery in Soho because it didn't pay enough to be respectable. Every single decision I've ever made has been about maintaining the Sullivan image, about meeting your expectations, about being the perfect daughter in your perfect world." Her hands were shaking now, but not from fear, from the release of finally speaking her truth. "I'm done thinking. I'm done waiting for your approval. I'm done living my life according to your script. I'm doing this." James's jaw clenched, the muscles in his face tight with barely controlled rage. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous tone. "If you walk out that door to pursue this ridiculous gallery, don't expect us to bail you out when you fail. Don't come crawling back asking for money or connections when your little experiment collapses. You're on your own." "I don't expect anything from you anymore," Emma said, and the words felt like liberation. "I haven't expected anything real from you in years." She turned toward the foyer, her legs unsteady but carrying her forward. Behind her, she heard her father's chair scrape against the hardwood floor. "Emma Sullivan." His voice echoed through the high-ceilinged room, bouncing off the walls lined with family portraits of ancestors who all wore the same expression of stern disapproval. "If you leave this house right now, if you pursue this path against our explicit wishes, you're choosing to leave this family. Do you understand what that means? Is that really what you want?" Emma paused at the doorway, her hand on the cold brass handle that suddenly felt like the most important object in the world. She thought about her grandmother Helen, who had died 3 years ago after a long battle with cancer. Helen had been an artist once, before marrying into the Sullivan family and having her own dreams quietly, systematically suffocated under the weight of expectations and social obligations. In her final weeks, when the morphine made her honest in ways she'd never been before, Helen had held Emma's hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Don't let them cage you like they caged me. I gave up everything I loved to be Mrs. Charles Sullivan, and I died wondering who I might have been. Promise me you won't do the same." Emma had promised. And Helen had left her money, $200,000 specifically designated in her will, managed through a trust that had been released to Emma 5 years ago. Money that her parents had reluctantly handed over, no doubt expecting Emma to spend it on their terms. Yes, Emma said without turning around, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. That's exactly what I want. She pulled open the door and walked out into the December evening, closing it firmly behind her on 30 years of conditional love, impossible expectations, and a life that had never really been hers to live. The cold hit her immediately. She'd forgotten her heavy coat in her rush to leave, but she kept walking down the long driveway, her breath visible in the frigid air. Behind her, the Sullivan estate glowed with warm light, looking like something from a magazine spread. Beautiful. Perfect. Empty. Emma didn't look back. The confrontation should have been the end of it. Emma spent the next 2 weeks staying with her friend Maya in a cramped but warm apartment in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. She slept on an air mattress in the tiny living room, surrounded by moving boxes containing her life's possessions, mostly clothes, books, and art supplies she'd managed to retrieve from her old bedroom when her parents were out. She avoided her parents' calls, which came frequently at first, her mother's clipped voicemails demanding she stop this nonsense and her father's messages alternating between anger and cold disappointment. After a few days, the calls stopped. The silence was somehow worse than the harassment. Emma threw herself into preparing for the gallery opening. She met with artists, negotiated with contractors about renovating the space, designed promotional materials with Maya's help. Maya, a graphic designer who understood what it meant to pursue creative dreams despite family pressure, had become Emma's lifeline. "You're doing the right thing," Maya told her repeatedly, usually late at night when Emma's resolve wavered. "Your parents are toxic. This is going to be amazing." But doubt crept in during quiet moments. What if her father was right? What if she failed? She'd burned every bridge, cut every safety net. The gallery had to succeed, not just for her dreams, but for her survival. Christmas Eve arrived cold and crystalline. Emma had planned to spend it quietly with Maya, maybe watch old movies and drink cheap wine. But at noon, her phone rang from an unknown number. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Emma, darling, it's Mom." Catherine's voice was controlled, almost pleasant, a tone Emma hadn't heard in weeks. "You need to come to the house tonight for Christmas dinner." Emma's stomach knotted with immediate suspicion. "Why would I do that?" "Because your father and I have discussed things at length, and we've realized we may have been too harsh." Catherine paused, letting the words sink in. "We're willing to talk. Really talk. About finding a compromise. About supporting your gallery in a way that makes sense for everyone involved." "A compromise?" Emma repeated skeptically. "Yes. We understand this is important to you. We want to find a middle ground. But we can't do that if you won't even speak to us." Catherine's voice softened in a way that sounded almost genuine. "Please, Emma. It's Christmas. Family should be together, especially during the holidays. Whatever our differences, you're still our daughter." Emma closed her eyes, feeling the familiar tug of hope mixed with suspicion. Some part of her, the part that still desperately wanted her parents' acceptance despite everything, whispered that maybe, just maybe, they'd had a change of heart. People could change. Couldn't they? "What kind of compromise are we talking about?" Emma asked carefully. "Come to dinner and we'll discuss it properly. Face to face, like adults. Bring your business plan if you'd like. We'll listen with open minds." Catherine paused. 7 o'clock. "Please don't make us spend Christmas without our only child." Against every instinct screaming at her to refuse, and despite Maya's concerned warnings, Emma agreed. She told herself it was worth trying one more time. Maybe the holiday spirit had softened them. Maybe they'd realized how much they were pushing her away. She should have known better. The Sullivan estate was decorated elaborately for the holiday season. White lights wrapped every tree and shrub on the property, creating a winter wonderland effect that belonged in a magazine spread. An enormous Douglas fir dominated the foyer, decorated with expensive ornaments collected over 3 generations of Sullivans, each one with a story about family legacy and tradition. The house smelled of pine, cinnamon, and the elaborate catered meal being prepared somewhere in the depths of the kitchen by staff hired for the occasion. Emma arrived at 7 wearing a simple black dress she'd bought at a thrift store in Brooklyn. Her expensive wardrobe had stayed at her parents' house, and she refused to ask for it back. Her hair was pulled into a neat bun. Her hands, usually stained with paint or charcoal now, were scrubbed clean. She tried to look presentable, respectable, worthy of reconsideration. The first sign that something was wrong came when she entered the dining room and saw not just her parents, but 20 other guests seated around the long mahogany table. Extended family, Aunt Patricia and Uncle Robert, her cousins James Jr. and Madison. Business associates she recognized from past dinner parties. Even Congressman Morrison and his wife, prominent figures in Westchester County politics. This wasn't an intimate family reconciliation. This was a performance, and Emma had been cast as the villain. "Emma, darling, you made it." Catherine stood, her smile bright and cold as winter's sun on ice. "Come, sit. We've saved you a place." The seat was at the far end of the table, positioned so Emma would be visible to everyone. Positioned for maximum exposure. She sat slowly, her instincts screaming that this was wrong, all wrong. Dinner proceeded with excruciating politeness at first. Polite conversation about stock markets and vacation homes. Discussion of the upcoming charity gala. Questions about Madison's engagement to a banker from a prominent Connecticut family. Emma remained quiet, pushing roasted vegetables and prime rib around her plate, counting the minutes until she could leave with whatever dignity remained. Then James stood with his wine glass, preparing to make his traditional holiday toast. The table fell silent. Emma looked up and saw something in her father's eyes that made her blood run cold. This was planned. All of it. "Before we toast to the season," James began, his voice carrying across the dining room with practiced authority, "I think it's important to address something that's been weighing on Catherine and myself. Something that affects this family." Emma's hands gripped her napkin under the table. "Some people," James continued, his gaze moving around the table before settling on Emma, "don't appreciate the opportunities they're given. They throw away family legacy for selfish pursuits. They reject the values and wisdom of those who came before them." His voice hardened. "They choose to be disappointments." Emma felt every face turn toward her. 20 pairs of eyes, watching her humiliation. Her cheeks burned. This wasn't a reconciliation. This was a public execution. Emma has decided she knows better than the family that raised her, educated her, gave her every advantage, James declared, his voice rising. "She's rejected our business, our guidance, our very way of life. She wants to open an art gallery in some questionable neighborhood, associating with people we don't know, pursuing a venture that will almost certainly fail." "Dad, please," Emma started to stand, her voice shaking. "Sit down," Catherine commanded sharply, her voice cutting through the room. "You wanted honesty. You wanted us to talk. Well, here's the truth, Emma. You're an ungrateful, selfish child who's making a mockery of everything this family stands for. Everything we've built. Everything we've sacrificed." Emma looked desperately around the table at faces she'd known for years. Aunt Patricia, who used to braid her hair when she was little. Uncle Robert, who'd taught her to play chess. her cousins, who she'd spent summers with at the family compound in Cape Cod. Congressman Morrison, who'd written her a recommendation letter for college. Not one person spoke in her defense. Not one person met her eyes. They all just stared or looked away, complicit in her humiliation through their silence. This was the price of going against the Sullivan family, public shaming and social exile. "If you want to throw away everything we've built, everything we've offered you," James declared, his face flushed with righteous anger or perhaps wine, "then you can do it without our support. Without our home. Without our protection. Without our name." He set his wine glass down with deliberate force. "Get out of this house, Emma. Pack your belongings, if you have any left here, and leave. You're no longer welcome in this family." The words struck like physical blows, knocking the air from Emma's lungs. "You're kicking me out? On Christmas Eve? In front of all these people?" "You made your choice weeks ago," Catherine said, her voice ice-cold. "We're simply making ours clear. We're done enabling your delusions. We're done watching you embarrass this family. You wanted independence? Congratulations. You have it. Now leave." Emma stood on shaking legs, the room spinning slightly. She could hear someone, Aunt Patricia, maybe, gasp softly, but no one spoke up. No one said, "James, this is too far." No one said, "Catherine, she's your daughter." The silence was deafening, damning. She grabbed her coat from the foyer with numb fingers, her breath coming in ragged gasps that she fought to control. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. As she fumbled with the heavy front door, she heard her father's final words, delivered loud enough for everyone to hear. "You'll come crawling back when you're living in a shelter, when reality finally hits you. And we'll see how humble you are then. We'll see if you still think you're better than this family." Emma stumbled out into the frigid December night. Snow had begun to fall heavily, thick flakes that immediately coated her hair and shoulders. She walked down the long driveway without looking back, tears finally breaking free and freezing on her cheeks. Her thin coat, she'd forgotten to grab her heavy winter one, was inadequate against the bitter wind that cut through to her bones. Behind her, the warm lights of the Sullivan estate glowed against the winter darkness, windows filled with the silhouettes of people resuming their dinner. She could hear voices resuming, even laughter. The party continued as if nothing had happened. As if she had never existed. As if 30 years of her life could be erased in a single evening. Emma walked until her feet went numb, following the winding Westchester roads toward the train station nearly 2 miles away. She had nowhere else to go. Her apartment lease didn't start until January 5th. Maya's apartment was 40 minutes away by train. She pulled out her phone with trembling hands and called her friend. "Emma? What's wrong? I thought you were at dinner." Maya answered immediately, concern sharp in her voice. Through chattering teeth and tears Emma struggled to contain, she tried to explain. But then she heard something that made her stop mid-sentence, her words dying in her throat. Police sirens. Getting closer. Multiple vehicles. Emma turned and looked back toward the Sullivan estate, her heart hammering with sudden dread. 2 Westchester County police cruisers were pulling into the circular driveway, their lights flashing red and blue against the falling snow and the white lights decorating the trees. Something was very, very wrong. "Maya, I have to go," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The police just showed up." She ended the call and started running back toward the house, slipping on the icy driveway, her confusion mixing with a terrible sense of foreboding. What had her parents done now? Emma's lungs burned from the cold air and exertion as she ran back toward the Sullivan estate. The police cruiser's lights cast eerie shadows through the falling snow, blue and red strobing across the perfectly manicured grounds. By the time she reached the circular driveway, Both officers had already exited their vehicles and were approaching the front entrance where her father stood, still wearing his holiday sweater, his expression calm and calculated. A female officer in her 40s with sharp, assessing eyes noticed Emma's approach. She was tall, with her dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, her hand resting casually near her service weapon in that way officers had when they weren't sure what situation they were walking into. "Are you Emma Sullivan?" the officer called out. "Yes," Emma gasped, out of breath, her heart pounding. "What's happening? Is someone hurt? Did something happen at the house?" The officer exchanged a glance with her partner, a younger man with a concerned expression that suggested he was less comfortable with whatever they'd been called here to do. "We received a call about a property dispute. We need to speak with you about a residence at 347 East 10th Street in Manhattan." Emma's heart dropped into her stomach with such force that she actually swayed on her feet. Her apartment. The small but beautiful one-bedroom she'd found after months of searching, with exposed brick walls and high ceilings and south-facing windows that filled the space with light. The place she'd bought with her grandmother's inheritance, the money Helen had left specifically for her, managed through a trust until Emma turned 25 5 years ago. "What about my apartment?" Emma's voice came out small, childlike, terrified. James stepped forward from the doorway, and Emma caught the gleam of triumph in his eyes, the same look he got when he closed a particularly advantageous business deal. "Officers, as I explained on the phone, there's been a significant misunderstanding about that property. The funds used to purchase it came from family trusts that were managed improperly, and we've discovered some serious irregularities in how the inheritance was distributed to my daughter." "That's not true," Emma said, her voice rising with desperation. "My grandmother left that money specifically to me. It's all documented in her will. I have copies of everything, the trust documents, the bank transfers, the purchase agreement. Everything is legal and proper." The male officer held up a hand in a calming gesture. "Ma'am, please understand, we're not here to determine ownership or settle a family dispute. We're here because Mr. Sullivan has filed official paperwork with the county clerk claiming fraudulent transfer of trust funds. He's also filed a motion in Manhattan Civil Court pursuing legal action to contest your ownership of the East 10th Street property." Emma felt like someone had reached into her chest and squeezed her heart. "You're trying to take my apartment? The one I bought with Grandma Helen's money? The money she left to me?" Catherine appeared beside James, wrapped in an expensive cashmere shawl, her makeup still perfect despite the late hour. Her voice was cold and clinical. "That money was part of complex family holdings, Emma. Your grandmother didn't have the legal authority to designate it solely to you. The trust structure was far more complicated than she understood in her final years. She was elderly, on medication, not thinking clearly about financial and legal matters. She understood perfectly." Emma's voice cracked with emotion. "She left it to me because she knew exactly what you were like. She knew you'd try to control every aspect of my life with money. She wanted me to be free from you. She told me that. She wrote it in letters." "Your grandmother was 78 years old and dying of cancer," James said with practiced sympathy that didn't reach his eyes. "She was on significant pain medication that affected her judgment. Our lawyers have thoroughly reviewed the trust documents and have filed the appropriate legal challenges. As of this moment, until this matter is resolved in court, you're potentially residing in property that doesn't legally belong to you." The female officer looked distinctly uncomfortable now, shifting her weight from foot to foot. Emma could see in her face that she recognized this for what it was, a wealthy family using the legal system as a weapon. But there was nothing she could do about it except enforce the procedures. "Miss Sullivan," the officer said more gently, "this is a civil matter that needs to be resolved through the court system. I strongly suggest you gather all your documentation, every piece of paper related to the purchase, the inheritance, the trust, everything, and contact a lawyer immediately. Mr. Sullivan has filed for an emergency hearing to prevent any transfer or sale of the property while the ownership is being contested in court. An emergency hearing? Emma could barely process what was happening, each word hitting like a separate blow. When? Within the next 2 weeks, most likely, the officer replied. You'll receive official notification. But Miss Sullivan, I need you to understand something clearly. If the court rules in your father's favor, yes, there's a real possibility of eviction from the property. Eviction, Emma repeated numbly. From my own apartment. From the home I bought with my own money. That's for a judge to determine, the younger officer said, his voice tinged with sympathy that made everything worse. I'm sorry, miss. We're just here to ensure you're aware of the legal proceedings. Emma stared at her parents through the falling snow. James stood straight and proud, satisfaction radiating from him like heat. Catherine's face showed no emotion at all, just the carefully maintained mask of dignified suffering, as if she were the victim in all of this, forced to take harsh action against an ungrateful child. This wasn't just about kicking her out of their home on Christmas Eve. This was systematic destruction, carefully planned and executed with precision. They hadn't just thrown her out, they'd waited, planned, coordinated with their lawyers, filed paperwork. This had been in motion for days, maybe weeks. You knew, Emma said, her voice shaking with anger now instead of fear. When you called me today, when you invited me here for reconciliation, you'd already filed the paperwork. You'd already called your lawyers. You'd already set this in motion. She laughed bitterly, a sound without humor. You wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone first. You wanted witnesses to how difficult I am, how unreasonable. You wanted to destroy me publicly before you destroyed me financially. James's expression remained neutral, but his eyes glinted with cold triumph. You wanted independence, Emma. You wanted to reject this family and everything we've built. Well, welcome to the real world. Independence means standing on your own. Actions have consequences. Choices have prices. You're about to learn that lesson the hard way. The real world? Emma's voice rose. You mean the world where parents weaponize their own daughter's inheritance? Where they use the legal system to make her homeless? That real world? Watch your tone, Catherine snapped. We're protecting family assets that you're mismanaging. We're doing what's necessary to control me, Emma cut her off. That's all this has ever been about. Control. You can't stand that I made a choice you didn't approve of, so you're taking everything. You're trying to leave me with nothing, so I'll have to come back and beg. The officers began returning to their vehicles, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding before them. The female officer handed Emma a business card. This has information about legal aid services if you need them. There are also organizations that help with housing disputes. I'm truly sorry, miss. Family disputes are always the hardest. As the police cruisers pulled away, their lights disappearing down the long driveway, Emma stood in the falling snow staring at her parents. They were already turning back toward the house, toward the warm lights and the dinner party that was probably resuming, toward their perfect life that required her elimination. This won't work, Emma called out, her voice stronger than she felt. I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to come crawling back. James paused at the door and looked back at her, snow catching in his silver hair. We'll see, Emma. We'll see how long your pride lasts when you're sleeping on your friend's couch and the eviction notice arrives. We'll see how brave you feel when the lawyers start deposing you, when your bank accounts are frozen pending the court's decision, when you realize you can't even afford to fight us. The door closed with a heavy finality that echoed across the snow-covered grounds. Through the windows, Emma could see the dinner party resuming, people returning to their seats, servants bringing out dessert, life continuing as if nothing significant had happened. Emma pulled out her phone with numb, shaking fingers and called Maya back. When her friend answered, Emma's voice was surprisingly calm despite the tears streaming down her face. "I need more than just your couch, Maya. I need a lawyer. The best lawyer we can possibly find." She took a shuddering breath, watching the lights of the Sullivan estate burn warm and bright against the winter darkness. "Because I'm going to fight this. I don't care how long it takes. I don't care what it costs. I don't care if I have to stand up in court and tell the whole world what kind of people my parents really are." She started walking again, down the driveway toward the distant lights of the train station, leaving footprints in the fresh snow that were already being covered by the continuing storm. "They're not taking the one thing Grandma Helen gave me. They're not winning this time. They think I'm nothing without them? I'm going to prove them wrong." The office of Patricia Chen, attorney at law, was located in a modest 3-story building in Chinatown, wedged between a dumpling restaurant and a shop selling imported ceramics. Emma climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor on January 3rd, her arms full of folders and her stomach churning with anxiety. The office itself was small but professional, with law books lining one wall and framed diplomas from Columbia Law School hanging beside a window that looked out onto Mott Street. Patricia Chen sat behind a desk piled with case files, her silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a practical bun, her eyes sharp and intelligent behind reading glasses. "You must be Emma," Patricia said, standing to shake her hand. "Maya's told me about your situation. Sit, please. Tell me everything, and don't leave anything out, no matter how small it seems." Emma had spent the past week gathering documents while staying on Maya's air mattress. She'd barely slept, surviving on coffee and determination. Now she spread everything across Patricia's desk: bank statements showing the trust transfer, her grandmother's will, the mortgage documents for her apartment, even her grandmother's death certificate and medical records proving she'd been of sound mind when she executed her will. "My grandmother, Helen Sullivan, died 3 years ago," Emma began, her voice steadier than she felt. "Before she died, she updated her will to leave me $200,000 from her personal investments and savings. Not family money, her money. She'd been managing her own portfolio for years, money she inherited from her own mother." Patricia examined the will carefully, making notes on a legal pad. "This is very clearly stated. To my granddaughter, Emma Catherine Sullivan, I leave the sum of $200,000 to be used as she sees fit for her education, housing, or pursuit of her chosen career." The language is explicit. "My parents are claiming she didn't understand the trust structure," Emma continued. "They're saying the money was actually part of larger family holdings and she didn't have the right to designate it specifically to me." "And was it?" Patricia asked directly. "No." Emma pulled out additional documents, trust paperwork showing Helen's separate accounts, investment statements in her grandmother's name alone, documentation of the inheritance Helen had received from her own mother's estate in 1985. These accounts were separate from the Sullivan family business. "My grandfather died in 1998, and Grandma Helen maintained her financial independence. She was extremely careful about keeping her money separate." Patricia's eyes gleamed with interest. "Smart woman. And your parents, they were aware of this separation?" "They had to be. My father was the trust manager, but only as executor. He didn't have control over the funds, he just facilitated the transfer when I turned 25, exactly as the will specified. He signed off on everything. The bank has records." Emma handed over more statements. "The transfer happened 5 years ago, when I was 25. I kept the money in a separate account, saved it. When I found the apartment last year, I used $150,000 as a down payment." Everything was legal and proper. Patricia leaned back in her chair, studying Emma with an expression that was hard to read. Here's what you need to understand about what your parents are doing. They've filed a motion to contest the trust distribution, claiming your grandmother was either incompetent or confused about which assets were truly hers to bequeath. They're also claiming that you somehow coerced or unduly influenced her, a common tactic in these cases. But I didn't. Emma protested. I barely even knew about the money until after she died. Grandma Helen didn't tell me she was leaving me anything. I believe you, Patricia said calmly. But believing you isn't enough. We need to prove it. Tell me about your grandmother's mental state in her final months. Was she lucid? Was she on medication that might have affected her judgment? Emma thought back to those painful final weeks. She had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Yes, she was on pain medication, morphine, but she was lucid until the very end. She made jokes. She remembered everything. She knew exactly what she was doing. Who was her doctor? Dr. Sarah Mendoza at New York Presbyterian. She attended Grandma Helen for the last 6 months. Patricia made a note. We'll need her testimony. Medical records showing cognitive function. Anything that proves your grandmother was of sound mind. She looked up sharply. Did anyone else witness your grandmother expressing her wishes? Anyone who can testify to her intentions? Emma suddenly remembered. Dorothy Martinez. She was Grandma Helen's best friend since college. They had lunch together every week until Grandma got too sick. She visited her in the hospital. She was there when Emma's voice caught. She was there when Grandma died. Contact information? Emma pulled out her phone and found Dorothy's number. She lives in Forest Hills. She's 75 now, but she's sharp as a tack. Patricia was already typing. I'll contact her today. If she's willing to testify about your grandmother's intentions, about her mental clarity, that could be crucial. She paused, her expression becoming more serious. Emma, I need you to understand something. Your parents have filed with Carson and Whitmore. They're one of the most aggressive corporate law firms in Manhattan. They have unlimited resources. They'll file motion after motion trying to delay, trying to exhaust your resources, trying to make you give up. I'm not giving up. Good. Because this is going to get expensive and ugly. They'll subpoena your bank records, your employment history, your college records. They'll try to paint you as financially irresponsible or emotionally unstable. They'll dig into every aspect of your life looking for ammunition. Emma thought about the modest apartment she was about to lose, the gallery dream that might die before it even began. How much is this going to cost? Patricia named a figure that made Emma's stomach drop. The retainer alone would wipe out most of her remaining savings. However, Patricia continued, I have a connection that might help. There's a pro bono legal foundation I work with. They specialize in cases involving family financial abuse. Wealthy parents using money as a weapon against their children. It's more common than you'd think. If they take your case, they can provide additional support, junior lawyers to help with research and filing. It would significantly reduce your costs. Would they help me? I think they might. Your case hits all their criteria: clear documentation, sympathetic circumstances, obvious abuse of the legal system. Patricia pulled out a business card. I'll make the call today. In the meantime, I need you to do something for me. Anything. Write down everything you remember about your relationship with your grandmother. Every conversation about money, about your future, about her wishes. Every time your parents tried to control financial decisions. Every instance you can remember of them using money as leverage. Dates, details, witnesses. Everything. Emma nodded, feeling overwhelmed but determined. Over the following days, she wrote pages and pages of memories, some painful, some beautiful. She remembered being 12 and her grandmother saying, "Art is important, Emma. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She remembered being 17 and Grandma Helen slipping her money for art supplies her parents wouldn't buy. She remembered being 23 and her grandmother saying, "The money I'm leaving you, use it for something that makes you happy. Don't let them tell you what to do with it." Dorothy Martinez came through spectacularly. When Patricia called her, she immediately offered to help. "Helen was my best friend for 50 years, Dorothy said during their first meeting in Patricia's office. She was terrified that James and Catherine would control Emma the same way they'd controlled her. "She made me promise to keep certain things safe, just in case." "What things?" Patricia asked. Dorothy opened her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside were letters, handwritten notes from Helen Sullivan, dated over the last 2 years of her life. Letters explicitly stating her wishes for Emma's inheritance and her concerns about her son and daughter-in-law's controlling behavior. Emma read them through tears. Her grandmother's familiar handwriting filled page after page with words she'd never gotten to hear. January 15, 2022, lunch with Dorothy today. We talked about Emma. She's so bright, so talented, but James and Catherine are crushing her spirit. I can see it happening the same way it happened to me. I married Charles Sullivan and stopped being Helen Morrison. I stopped painting. I stopped creating. I became Mrs. Sullivan, hostess and ornament. I won't let that happen to Emma. The money I'm leaving her isn't much, but it's enough to give her a start at whatever life she chooses. Not the life chosen for her." March 3, 2022, told Emma today that she has an artist's soul like my mother had. Catherine overhead and made some dismissive comment about hobbies versus careers. I wanted to scream at her. Art isn't a hobby. Creating isn't frivolous. I gave up my painting and I've regretted it every day for 45 years. November 12, 2022, doctor says I have maybe 4 months. I'm not afraid of dying, but I'm terrified of leaving Emma alone with them. Dorothy promised to keep these letters safe. If James and Catherine try to contest the will or control the money, Dorothy will help Emma fight back. They think they can control everything with money and intimidation, but I'm going to make sure Emma has a chance to be free. Patricia included the letters in their evidence file. "These are gold," she said quietly. "Your grandmother knew exactly what she was doing." The Pro Bono Foundation agreed to take Emma's case. A young lawyer named Marcus, barely 30 but brilliant, joined their team. Together, they built a fortress of evidence, medical records proving Helen's mental competency, bank records showing the separate accounts, testimony from Dorothy and Dr. Mendoza, the letters, and most damning of all, records showing that James Sullivan himself had signed the trust transfer documents 5 years ago without any objection or concern. He approved the transfer, Marcus said, spreading documents across the conference table. He signed off on it as executor. He certified to the bank that the funds were being properly distributed according to the will. He can't claim now that it was improper. He validated it himself. So why didn't he object back then? Emma asked. Patricia exchanged a knowing look with Marcus. Because 5 years ago, you weren't defying them yet. 5 years ago, you were still the compliant daughter. They probably thought they could still control how you spent the money. It wasn't until you made it clear you were truly leaving, opening the gallery, moving out, that they decided to take it back. Emma felt rage burning in her chest. So this whole thing is punishment? Exactly, Patricia confirmed. And that's what we're going to prove in court. By late February, they had built their case. Carson and Whitmore had filed motion after motion, requests for delays, demands for additional documentation, attempts to depose Emma about everything from her college grades to her credit card purchases. Each motion was clearly designed to exhaust and intimidate. But Patricia and her team countered every move. They filed their own motions. They gathered more evidence. They prepared for war. The hearing was set for Manhattan Civil Court, late February. Emma received the official notice and felt her stomach drop despite being prepared for it. This was really happening. She was going to face her parents in court. "Are you ready?" Maya asked the night before the hearing. Emma thought about her grandmother's letters, about Dorothy's testimony, about the months of work building the case. She thought about the gallery space she'd signed a lease for, sitting empty because she'd used every dollar for legal fees instead of renovations. She thought about sleeping on Maya's air mattress and living out of boxes and wondering if she'd made a catastrophic mistake. "I'm ready," Emma said. "I'm going to fight." The Manhattan Civil Court building on Center Street was an imposing structure of limestone and granite, its classical columns and arched windows suggesting the weight of justice. Emma climbed the steps beside Patricia Chen on a cold February morning, her hands shaking despite her determination to appear strong. She wore a simple navy suit Maya had helped her pick out from a consignment shop, professional but not expensive, exactly the image they wanted to project. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun. She carried a folder with copies of all their evidence, though Patricia had the originals. "Remember," Patricia said quietly as they entered the building, "let me do the talking unless the judge addresses you directly. Don't react to anything your parents or their lawyers say. Don't show anger, don't show hurt. Stay calm and dignified. You're the reasonable one here." Emma nodded, her throat too tight to speak. They passed through security and took the elevator to the 4th floor. Courtroom 4B was smaller than Emma had expected from watching legal dramas on television. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, unforgiving glow. Wooden benches lined both sides, separated by a center aisle. The judge's bench loomed at the front, elevated and imposing. And there, across the aisle at the plaintiff's table, sat her parents. James Sullivan looked confident and relaxed in an expensive charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. Catherine sat beside him in a cream-colored dress and pearls, her makeup flawless, her posture perfect. They looked like what they were, wealthy, respectable members of society. Victims of an ungrateful daughter. Their legal team surrounded them, 3 lawyers from Carson and Whitmore in suits that cost more than Emma's monthly rent. Richard Whitmore himself, the senior partner, sat at the head of their table. He was in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that came from decades of courtroom victories. His briefcase was open, papers perfectly organized in neat folders. Emma's parents didn't look at her as she entered. They didn't acknowledge her presence at all. It was as if she was invisible, already erased from their lives. Patricia led Emma to the defendant's table. Marcus was already there, his laptop open, ready to pull up documents at a moment's notice. Dorothy Martinez sat in the gallery behind them, having arrived early to offer support. She gave Emma an encouraging smile. At 9 o'clock precisely, the bailiff called out, "All rise." The Honorable Margaret Reeves presiding. Judge Reeves entered from her chambers, a black woman in her 60s with close-cropped silver hair and an expression that suggested she'd seen every trick in the book and wasn't impressed by any of them. She'd been on the bench for over 20 years with a reputation for being fair but no nonsense, particularly impatient with wealthy people trying to manipulate the system. "Please be seated," Judge Reeves said, settling behind her bench and putting on reading glasses. "This is a motion to dismiss filed by the defendant, Emma Sullivan, in response to the plaintiff's claim disputing the transfer of trust funds. This court has received motions and counter-motions from both parties. I've reviewed the preliminary filings." She looked over her glasses at both tables. This appears to be a straightforward trust dispute, yet somehow we've generated hundreds of pages of documentation. Let's see if we can cut through the noise today. Emma's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. Mr. Whitmore, you're representing the plaintiffs. Lay out your case concisely, please. Richard Whitmore stood with the smooth confidence of someone who'd won hundreds of cases. Your Honor, this case concerns the improper distribution of approximately $200,000 from a family trust. The deceased, Helen Sullivan, believed she was bequeathing her personal funds to her granddaughter, Emma Sullivan. However, our evidence will show that Mrs. Helen Sullivan was confused about the true nature of these assets. The funds in question were actually part of a larger family trust structure that she had access to but did not personally own. Do you have documentation showing this alternative trust structure? Judge Reeves asked sharply. We're working to subpoena those records, Your Honor. The original trust documents from the 1980s are somewhat difficult to locate. So you don't have them, Judge Reeves interrupted. What you do have? Whitmore cleared his throat. We have testimony from James Sullivan, who served as executor of his mother's estate, stating that his mother was confused in her final months about which assets were truly hers to distribute. We also have concerns about whether the defendant unduly influenced Mrs. Helen Sullivan given the suspicious timing of the will's update. Suspicious timing? Judge Reeves looked at her notes. The will was executed 2 years before Mrs. Sullivan's death, correct? Yes, Your Honor, but... And Mrs. Sullivan updated her will while she was healthy, before her cancer diagnosis? Well, yes, technically, but we believe. Mr. Whitmore, Judge Reeves's voice was sharp, I'm asking about facts, not beliefs. Was Helen Sullivan diagnosed with any cognitive impairment? No, Your Honor, however given her age and the medications she was taking. Was she taking cognitive impairing medications at the time the will was executed? Whitmore hesitated. Not at that specific time, but... So a mentally competent woman updated her own will 2 years before her death, clearly stating her wishes for her granddaughter, and you're arguing this was somehow improper? Emma watched her father's jaw tighten. This wasn't going the way they'd expected. Your Honor, Whitmore pivoted, we believe there are questions about whether the defendant has demonstrated responsible management of these funds. We've filed documentation showing. Stop right there, Judge Reeves held up a hand. This is not a competency hearing for Ms. Emma Sullivan. She's 30 years old and by all accounts has managed her finances appropriately. The only question before this court is whether the trust funds were properly transferred according to Helen Sullivan's will. Ms. Chen, I assume you have something to say about that? Patricia stood, and Emma could feel the quiet power in her lawyer's presence. Your Honor, this case is straightforward. Helen Sullivan left a legally executed will designating $200,000 specifically to her granddaughter. The trust was managed according to the terms of that will, and the funds were properly transferred to Emma at age 25, exactly as specified. The plaintiffs are attempting to retroactively contest a will that was executed 7 years ago, well past any legal statute of limitations for such challenges. She presented the bank statements, the will with its clear language, the trust documents showing Helen's separate accounts, and the transfer records showing James Sullivan's own signature approving the distribution. Most significantly, Your Honor, Patricia continued, Mr. James Sullivan himself signed these transfer documents 5 years ago as executor, certifying to the financial institutions that the distribution was proper and in accordance with his mother's wishes. He raised no objections at that time. He validated this transfer personally. Judge Reeves looked sharply at James Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan, you signed these documents? James stood, and Emma could see him shifting into his business persona, confident, authoritative. Your Honor, I signed them because at the time I believed my daughter would use the funds responsibly, under our guidance. I didn't realize she would. That's not what I asked, Judge Reeves interrupted. Did you have concerns about the legality of the transfer at the time you signed these documents? No, Your Honor, but circumstances have changed. Circumstances have changed? Judge Reeves removed her glasses, her expression hardening. Let me understand this. When your daughter was compliant and under your control, the transfer was fine. But now that she's made decisions you don't approve of, suddenly the transfer is suspect? That's not, James started. Mr. Sullivan, I've been on this bench for 23 years. I know exactly what this is. Judge Reeves looked at the documents again. Ms. Chen, you also have witness testimony? Yes, Your Honor. We have Dr. Sarah Mendoza, who treated Helen Sullivan and can testify to her mental competency. We have Dorothy Martinez, Mrs. Sullivan's best friend of 50 years, who can speak to her intentions. And we have letters written by Helen Sullivan herself, expressing her explicit wishes for this inheritance and her concerns about her son and daughter-in-law's controlling behavior. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap, final and irrevocable. Motion to dismiss is granted, Judge Reeves declared, her voice carrying the full weight of legal authority. Emma Sullivan is the rightful owner of the property at 347 East 10th Street, Manhattan, purchased with funds legally inherited from Helen Sullivan. The eviction proceedings are dismissed with prejudice, meaning this matter cannot be relitigated. Emma felt Patricia's hand squeeze hers under the table, grounding her as the reality of the words sank in. She'd won. After months of fear, uncertainty, and fighting, she'd actually won. But Judge Reeves wasn't finished. She removed her glasses and looked directly at James and Catherine Sullivan with an expression of barely concealed disgust. Furthermore, I'm awarding court costs and reasonable attorney fees to the defendant. Mr. and Mrs. Sullivan, I want to be crystal clear about something. The judge's voice hardened. What you've done here, attempting to make your adult daughter homeless through frivolous legal action, using the court system as a weapon to punish her for making independent life choices, borders on abuse of process. If I see another case like this cross my bench from you, I will not hesitate to impose sanctions. James Sullivan's face had turned a dangerous shade of red, the veins in his neck standing out. Beside him, Catherine sat frozen, her carefully maintained mask finally cracking to show raw fury underneath. The trust documents clearly show Helen Sullivan maintained separate assets from the family business holdings, Judge Reeves continued, organizing her papers with deliberate movements. She was of sound mind when she executed her will, as confirmed by multiple witnesses and her physician. She explicitly stated her wishes for her granddaughter. And most damningly, Mr. Sullivan, you yourself validated this transfer 5 years ago by signing the executor's certification. You don't get to change your mind now because your daughter isn't living according to your specifications. She looked at Emma directly for the first time, her expression softening slightly. Ms. Sullivan, your grandmother left you that money so you could be free. This court will not allow her wishes to be overturned by family members who are more interested in control than her legacy. This case is dismissed. The gavel came down again, final and absolute. As people began standing and gathering their belongings, Emma sat frozen in her chair, unable to fully process what had just happened. Patricia was already on her feet, shaking Marcus's hand, thanking him for his work on the case. Behind them, Dorothy was crying quietly, happy tears streaming down her weathered face. Across the aisle, the Carson and Whitmore legal team was efficiently packing their expensive briefcases, already moving on to their next case, their next billable hours. But Emma's parents remained seated, James staring straight ahead with barely controlled rage while Catherine's hands trembled in her lap. Emma stood slowly. For a moment, she and her father made eye contact across the courtroom aisle, the first time they'd truly looked at each other since Christmas Eve. Emma saw hatred there, and wounded pride, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Regret, perhaps? Or just fury at losing control? James stood abruptly and walked toward her. Patricia immediately stepped forward, protective, but Emma gently touched her lawyer's arm. "It's okay," Emma said quietly. Her father stopped a few feet away, close enough for a private conversation but maintaining careful distance. When he spoke, his voice was low and tight with, "This isn't over, Emma. You may have one today, but you're still alone. Still nobody. That gallery of yours will fail within a year, and when it does, don't come looking for our help. You've burned every bridge." Emma looked at the man who had raised her, shaped her, and ultimately tried to destroy her. And she felt nothing. No anger, no hurt, no desperate need for his approval. The power he'd held over her for 30 years had simply evaporated in the harsh fluorescent light of a civil courtroom. "I don't need your help, Dad. I never really did. I just needed you to let me go." Emma's voice was calm, almost gentle. "Grandma Helen understood that. She left me that money because she knew what you'd try to do. She was protecting me from you, even after she was gone. Your grandmother was a foolish woman who never understood how the world really works," James said bitterly. "She wasted her life on frivolous pursuits, and she wanted the same for you. I was trying to save you from that mistake." "No," Emma replied. "You were trying to save yourself from having a daughter who didn't need you. That's what this has always been about. Control. Not love, not protection, just control." For a moment, James looked like he might say something else. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. But no words came. Finally, he turned and walked away, Catherine following silently behind him, her heels clicking against the marble floor with sharp, angry precision. Emma watched them leave the courtroom and felt something fundamental shift inside her. It wasn't closure, that implied some kind of resolution or understanding. It was simply ending. The chapter of her life dominated by their expectations, their manipulation, their conditional love had finally, definitively closed. "You okay?" Patricia asked, appearing at her elbow. "Yeah," Emma said, surprised to find it was true. "I think I really am." They gathered their materials and left the courthouse. Outside, the February air was cold but bright, the winter sun reflecting off the surrounding buildings with almost painful clarity. Dorothy waited for them on the courthouse steps, wrapped in a thick wool coat. "Your grandmother would be so proud," Dorothy said, pulling Emma into a tight hug. "So proud. You fought for yourself, just like she wanted you to." Emma hugged her back, breathing in the older woman's familiar perfume, the same scent her grandmother had worn. "Thank you for the letters. For keeping them safe. For helping me fight." "Helen asked me to promise I'd help you if this day ever came," Dorothy said, pulling back to look at Emma's face. She knew her son. She knew what he was capable of. Those letters were her final gift to you, proof that you weren't crazy, that you weren't wrong to want your own life. They had lunch at a small restaurant in Chinatown, celebrating the victory with dumplings and noodles that cost less than the appetizers at the restaurants Emma's parents frequented. Patricia explained the next steps. The court would formally transfer all costs and attorney fees to James and Catherine Sullivan, which would likely total close to $80,000. Emma's apartment was secure, legally and permanently hers. "What about the gallery?" Emma asked. "Can I finally move forward with that?" "Nothing's stopping you now," Patricia said with a smile. "You have your inheritance, your apartment is secure, and you're free from legal entanglements. Time to build that dream." Over the following months, Emma threw herself into creating Helen's space. The gallery occupied a narrow storefront in the East Village with exposed brick walls, high ceilings, and large windows that flooded the space with natural light. She spent weeks painting walls, installing track lighting, building display panels with help from Maya and a group of artist friends who'd rallied around the project. The transformation was both physical and metaphorical. As Emma rebuilt the space, she was rebuilding herself, discovering who she was without the weight of her parents' expectations crushing her. She made mistakes. She learned. She grew. She chose 12 emerging artists for the inaugural exhibition, each with a unique voice and perspective. Marcus Chen, who painted urban landscapes from unconventional angles. Sofia Rodriguez, whose sculptures transformed discarded materials into commentary on consumption. James Park, whose photographs captured intimate moments in immigrant communities. Artists whose work would never hang in the carefully curated spaces her parents approved of, but whose voices deserved to be heard. The gallery opened on April 15, a soft opening for friends and the featured artists. Emma wore paint-splattered jeans and a simple black shirt, her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked nothing like the carefully groomed Sullivan daughter her parents had tried to mold. As guests wandered through the space, Emma stood near the entrance where a small plaque hung beside a watercolor painting, one of her grandmother's own works, a delicate landscape of flowers and light that Dorothy had contributed to the gallery. The plaque read, "Helen's Space. For Grandma, who taught me that courage is choosing your own life, even when everyone tells you you're wrong." "It's beautiful," a voice said beside her. Emma turned to find an older couple examining the watercolor with genuine interest. The woman was perhaps 60, with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair pulled back in a casual style. "That's by Helen Sullivan," Emma explained. "She was my grandmother. She painted this in 1975, before she put away her brushes to become a proper society wife." "That's tragic," the woman said softly. "Such talent." "It was tragic," Emma agreed. "But she made sure I wouldn't make the same mistake. She gave me the courage and the means to follow my own path, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard." The man smiled. "Sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was," Emma said, meaning it with her whole heart. As the evening progressed, Emma moved through the gallery, talking with artists and guests, explaining pieces, sharing stories. She sold 3 pieces that first night, not enough to make the gallery profitable yet, but enough to feel like validation. People were interested. They were responding to the work, to the vision, to what she was trying to create. Near closing time, as Emma was saying goodbye to the last guests, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Her stomach clenched, wondering if it was her parents, if they'd found some new way to harass her. But the message was from someone else entirely. "Hi Emma, this is Catherine Monroe. I was a classmate of your grandmother's at the Art Students League in 1965. I saw the announcement for your gallery in the Village Voice and had to come by. I'm sorry I missed the opening, but I'd love to visit soon. Your grandmother talked about you constantly in her final years. She'd be so proud." Emma stared at the message, tears suddenly blurring her vision. Her grandmother's friend, someone who'd known Helen as a young artist before the Sullivan family had claimed her, before her dreams had been systematically dismantled. She replied immediately, "Please come. I'd love to hear stories about Grandma Helen as an artist." The gallery is open Tuesday through Sunday, November 7th. Thank you for reaching out. After locking up the gallery, Emma walked through the East Village streets toward her apartment. The spring evening was mild, the city alive with energy. She passed restaurants and bars, street musicians and artists selling their work on sidewalk tables, people living their lives in all their messy, authentic complexity. Her phone rang. "Maya." "How did it go?" her friend asked immediately. "Tell me everything." Emma laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. "It was perfect. Small, but perfect. We sold 3 pieces. People loved it. I think this might actually work, Maya. Of course it's going to work. You're brilliant and talented and finally free to be yourself. Maya paused. Have you heard from your parents at all? No. Nothing since the courthouse. Emma thought about that final confrontation with her father, his prediction that she'd fail, his certainty that she was nothing without them. I don't expect to. They've written me off completely. Good, Maya said fiercely. You don't need them. You never did. I know that now, Emma said. I really do. She hung up and continued walking, letting the city flow around her. As she turned onto East 10th Street, she saw her building, the brownstone she'd fought so hard to keep. Her home. Her space. Hers. Inside the apartment, Emma made tea and sat by the window, looking out at the street below. The exposed brick walls were now decorated with her own artwork and pieces by friends. The high ceilings made the small space feel open and full of possibility. It wasn't the sprawling estate in Westchester, with its perfect grounds and expensive furniture. It was better. It was real. She thought about her grandmother Helen, about the inheritance that was so much more than money. It was permission to be herself, to make mistakes, to choose courage over comfort. It was validation that her dreams mattered, that her art mattered, that she mattered. Emma pulled out a notebook and began sketching ideas for the next exhibition. An all-women show, perhaps, featuring artists over 50 who'd started their careers late, who'd had to fight for the chance to create. She'd call it Second Acts or maybe Finally Free. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Patricia Chin. Congratulations on the gallery opening. I drove by earlier and it looked wonderful. You've built something real. Helen would be proud. Hell, I'm proud, and I barely know you. Emma smiled and typed back, thank you for everything. For believing in me. For fighting for me. I couldn't have done this without you. You could have, Patricia replied. But I'm glad you didn't have to. You're stronger than you know, Emma Sullivan. Don't forget that. As the spring evening deepened into night, Emma sat in her apartment surrounded by art and possibility and the life she'd chosen. She'd lost her family but found herself. She'd been called nothing and proven she was everything that mattered, authentic, courageous, free. Somewhere in the universe, she imagined her grandmother smiling, paintbrush in hand, finally at peace knowing that at least one person in the Sullivan family had escaped the cage. Emma raised her teacup in a silent toast. I did it, Grandma. I'm free. And for the first time in 30 years, those words were completely, beautifully true.